I've been slowly reading through The Arabian Nights, Tales of 1001 Nights, translated by Malcolm C. Lyons, and I'm really enjoying it. It's a really fascinating collection of heroic, mythicized histories, moral fables, fairy tales, and jokes, but I wanted to talk about one particularly boring and incredibly interesting story, at least for me, called The Slave Girl Tawaddud, or Abul Hassan and His Slave Girl Tawaddud. Excuse the pronunciation. Now this story follows the recurring motif of a rich man dying and leaving all his wealth and possessions to his son, and it's usually enough money for multiple generations to live off in luxury, yet the son blows it all away and is left destitute, with only a single slave left. In this particular story, that slave is of course Tawaddud, and as is typically the case, she is the most intelligent and most beautiful woman ever. Of course, she is also deeply in love with her master. In this story, she tells her master to sell her to the Caliph, Harun al-Rashid, for no less than 10,000 dinars, which the master decides to do. To see her value, the Caliph orders the learned men of his realm to test her knowledge of science, faith, theology, and society, and she proves herself to be of greater intellect than any of the learned men, who are shamed and stripped of their robes. This having happened, the Caliph buys her for 100,000 dinars, and offers to grant her a wish, which is to be set free so she can marry her master. This wish is granted, along with a gift of 5,000 dinars, and the man becomes a close personal friend and boon companion of the Caliph. And so, as with other stories that follow this similar general structure, the indulgent wastrel ends up far better off than he ever was due to how incredible his slave is. Now this recurring plot arc isn't boring necessarily, but in this particular story the way Tawaddud proves herself is by answering a seemingly unending list of questions and then posing some in return. So the majority of the story is simply a list of things, what are considered axioms of philosophy and science and theology and whatever, for the society that created this story. So it is mind-numbingly boring as a story, but really very quite interesting for me, as someone who doesn't know all that much about medieval Islam and medieval Arabia and wants to learn. Obviously, there is a lot of nonsense pseudoscience in there, and there's also a lot of stuff on aspects of faith and tradition, but what I want to look at is the medicine and anatomy, more specifically the almost quite good understanding of the bones. It makes sense that anatomy is an aspect of science that could be expected to be understood fairly well by people from a millennium ago. After all, the human body hasn't changed in this time, and access to deceased people has always been possible. That being said, even within the last couple of years, new structural elements of the human body are being discovered, like the trans-cortical vessels, the mesentery, and the interstitium. Though the overall body plan has been pretty well understood for centuries. From the late 15th into the 16th century, work from people like Leonardo da Vinci showed incredibly accurate representations of the human body. Of course, ignoring the cow uterus and a couple of other issues. But this story is from many centuries prior to that, at the very least being set around 700 years before Da Vinci's time. Now in some cases we're effectively talking about simply a difference in paradigms when it comes to, dividing the body as an example. But we will hopefully razz on some mistakes. After all, what is tertiary education if not a springboard for roasting people from centuries ago? Now there's more anatomy, sciencey, and medical stuff in this story, but I'm sticking to the bones because it's the most comprehensive and comprehensible section. There's really no point in talking about humours. Obviously they're meaningless, or that, wow, sap rising in the wood isn't actually a good indicator of when medicine should be taken. Truly groundbreaking stuff indeed. But Tawaddud really gives the game away off the bat, with an incorrect total number of bones, and we'll get to this. Now some people might tell you that there are 206 bones. These people are of course lying fools. We have 210. And of those 210, I'm going to be mentioning 214. And this friendly but spooky skeleton will be keeping their eye holes on our running tally. However, she's not actually that far off. Tawaddud spends a handful of paragraphs listing the bones, starting with the head. The head comprises the cranium and the face. The cranium is composed of 8 bones, to which are added the 4 connected with the ears. The face has an upper and a lower jaw with 11 bones in the upper and 1 in the lower. Added to these are the 32 teeth, together with the hyoid bone. Now this starts off pretty well. 8 cranial bones is exactly correct. They are from the kind of front-inish bit, backwards-ish, the ethmoid bone, the frontal bone, the sphenoid bone, 2 temporal bones, 2 parietal bones, and the occipital bone. And many of you could probably tell some of their locations by the bit of the brain that they cover. But now we get a touch wobbly. The 4 bones connected with the ears. I'm guessing these 4 are supposed to be the 6 ossicles, 3 each side, the malleus, incus, and stapes. And the most disgusting looking eardrum I've ever seen depicted. Ugh. And it's totally understandable that this society got this wrong. I can imagine anyone doing a dissection of a cadaver, separating the incus from the stapes, and just assuming they broke a single really fine little baby bone. However, it gets worse. An upper and a lower jaw with 11 bones in the upper and 1 in the lower? Here we've got the facial bones, and 2 have been misplaced. If we're using Tawaddud's paradigm of upper and lower jaw, then we've got 13 upper and 1 lower. And quite a number of these bones are very not jaw bones at all, though. They are, in order of my personal preference in terms of value as percussion instruments, the 2 maxilla bones that fuse to make the upper jaw and might have some nice resonance, if hit, maybe? The mandible, our sad singular lower jaw bone that, for some reason in my mind, works like a marimba. The 2 zygomatic bones that maybe we could knock together or something. Then all the others are small weird shaped bits, and maybe we could rattle them all together. So their names don't really matter. But I will list them nonetheless. 2 nasal bones, 2 lacrimal bones, 2 palatine bones that form the part of the hard palate, the vomer, and 2 inferior nasal concha. Now, Tawaddud adds the teeth as bones, which kind of makes sense. They seem pretty bony, but of course they're not actually bones. Teeth are mostly made of a little cutie called dentine or dentine and covered with enamel. And as many people have probably heard, these hard boys are the hardest bits of our bods, whereas bones are full of weak, pathetic, incredibly resilient collagen that keeps these hard boys somewhat flexible and resistant to pressure. However, it's rounded off nicely with the final head bone, the little throat floater, the hyoid. And now she turns to the torso. As for the torso, it comprises the spinal column, the chest, and the pelvis. The spinal column is made up of 24 bones, known as the vertebrae. The chest has the breastbone and 24 ribs, 12 on each side. And the pelvis has the 2 hip bones, the sacrum and the coccyx. And this whole part is broadly fine. We've got the spinal column of 24 vertebrae, 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar. Tawaddud doesn't include the sacrum and coccyx as part of the spinal column, but would usually include these fused friends as bones 25 and 26 in a typical spine. Then the breastbone, called the sternum, and our 12 pairs of ribs, or costal bones. Finally, the 2 hip bones, or coxal bones, form the pelvis with the sacrum and coccyx. So now we've seen the entirety of the axial skeleton, plus the hips, which should really be part of the lower limb, but we must march further on. The limbs are divided into upper and lower limbs. Each of the upper limbs is divided in its turn. Firstly, into a shoulder, made up of a shoulder blade and a clavicle. Secondly, into an upper arm consisting of a single bone. Thirdly, into a forearm, which has 2 bones, the radius and the ulna. And fourthly, a hand, divided into wrist, metacarpus, and fingers. The wrist is composed of 8 bones set in 2 rows, with 4 in each row. The metacarpus has 5 bones, and the 5 fingers have 3 bones each, known as the phalanges, except for the thumb, which has only 2. Alright, let's go. We've got the shoulder blade or the scapula and the clavicle on each side. Then the old humerus makes up the single bone of the upper arm. The forearm is completely correct and named, radius on the outside of the anatomical position, or the thumb side, and the ulna elsewhere. Now the old hand bones, starting with the 8 carpals in 2 rows, of which only 2 matter, the scaphoid and lunate. The remaining 6, in order of base words with friends score from lowest to highest, are hamate, capitate, pisiform, trapezoid, triquetrum, and trapezium. The metacarpus, or palm, is made up of a bone for each finger, numbered 1 to 5 from the thumb to the pinky. Then the phalanges, proximal, intermediate, distal, except, as Tawaddud says, the thumb's a loser, no intermediate. Now there are a handful of other bones that may or may not be present in any individual, but one pair of floaters is actually really very common, and there's some little knockers on the thumb at the metacarpophalangeal joint, called metacarpophalangeal sesamoids, and we'll meet their foot equivalents soon, who are always present. Tawaddud continues. Each of the lower limbs is divided firstly into the thigh, which consists of a single bone, then the shank, comprising 3 bones, the fibula, the shin bone, and the knee bone, and thirdly there is the foot, which is divided, like the hand, into the ankle, the instep, and the toes. The ankle has 7 bones, set in 2 rows, the first with 2 bones and the second 5. The instep has 5 bones, and each of the 5 toes has 3 phalanges, except for the big toe, which has only 2. And it's pretty good. First, them thick thighs, made of a femur. The 3 shank boys are, in Tawaddud's order, the fibula, tibia, and the patella floating up top. Now the foot, also good. 2 in the back, the talus that joins the foot to the old leg, and the calcaneus makes the heel. Then we've got 5 more friends. These bad boys are made up of 3 cuneiforms, the cuboid, and the navicular. We've got the same setup as the hand. 5 metatarsals make up the instep, 1 for each toe, numbered 1 to 5 from the foot thumb. Then the same toe phalanges, 5 proximal, 4 intermediate, missing the biggie, and 5 distal. Finally, we've got them metatarsophalangeal sesamoids. So really not a bad job at all considering the teeth. If they weren't counted, should be at 202, embarrassingly missing 2 ear bones, 2 face bones, and all our little sesamoid friends. Not actually true, the patella's a sesamoid, so is the hyoid. So now that we've accidentally learned the bones of the human skeleton, we realize apparently Tawaddud actually knows a reasonable amount about anatomy. However, her intellectual capacity is dwarfed by me and modern medicine and tertiary education and the internet. Bye.